Hi, I'm Brian Grant, and you're listening to On Time, the Brian Grant Foundation podcast about living with Parkinson's. If you want to know more about Brian Grant Foundation, go to briangrant.org.
Hi, this is Katrina Call, Executive Director of the Brian Grant Foundation. Thank you for listening to our podcast, which is one of our many programs to help empower people impacted by Parkinson's disease to lead active and fulfilling lives. Our programs are possible because of the generous support of our donors. Please consider helping us continue this work by making a donation at briangrant.org. Thanks again for listening.
Joining us now is Air Force veteran Sara Whittingham. Sara was a Steamboat Springs High School track and cross-country star, ran track and cross-country at the U.S. Air Force Academy, even competed in the Steamboat Marathon on her wedding day. After you got married, you had 2 daughters. You did your residency in anesthesiology. And then in 2010, you were shipped off to Afghanistan with the U.S. Air Force for about 6 months. What was that like?
Well, that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life, was because I had 2 young daughters at the time. My oldest was 3 and my youngest was 6 months. The Air Force policy at the time was that they could deploy you at 6 months and they sent me like a week after that. So
wow,
really hard to leave my 2 young daughters and go over there. My youngest didn't know who I was when I got back, and I still get emotional thinking about it. But yeah, it was by far the hardest thing I've ever had to do for that reason. And then to get to Afghanistan, and I was prepared emotionally to be taking care of the American service members because I knew they were going to come home and get the best care that there is. But I wasn't emotionally prepared to take care of all the Afghani kids that we ended up taking care of who had injuries, and seeing my own kids and them, like seeing a 4-year-old who'd stepped on a landmine and, yes, we saved his life that day, but what is his life going to be like now that he's missing a leg, So things like that hit me a lot harder than I was prepared for. It was taking care of the locals, knowing that they weren't going to come back to, they weren't going to have access to the best medical care that there is once they leave our facility. So,
yeah, that's hard.
Yeah.
And back home was your husband and your 2 daughters.
Yeah. So my husband, he's a general surgeon, so he's pretty busy. Fortunately, both our mothers were able to spend quite a bit of time helping. My mom still lived in Steamboat, and we lived in Salt Lake at the time. So it was a 6-hour drive. She drove back and forth quite frequently to help out when needed. And then my husband's mom was there helping quite a bit too. My husband had to cut back on work a little bit, but yeah, we got through it. It was tough, but yeah.
What's his name?
John Langell.
Okay. And then 10 years later, how did Parkinson's first make itself known to you?
So I first noticed, I had been noticing weird things had been happening for several years, and I just kind of blew it off to think getting older and didn't really think anything of it. The thing that led me to initially go to a neurologist was sitting on the couch one evening in November 2020, and my husband commented that my left arm was shaking. And I hadn't noticed it was shaking. And I looked at it, I said, oh, that's kind of weird. Why would that be happening? And, so I Googled it, and unilateral resting arm tremor. And it was one thing about Parkinson's after another. And, I'm a physician, so I had learned.
I love that the physician is going to Dr. Google. I love
Yes,
that.
Exactly. I had learned about Parkinson's 20 years ago as a medical student. In my mind, I picture, a hunched over older man. This person with Parkinson's didn't look anything like me. And so, but as I started to learn more about the detailed specifics about it, I was like, wait, I've been having, being very stiff in the morning, and, my running has become more and more difficult. And, all these things that had, my husband was always asking me why I walk like an old lady, or why the volume of my voice would trail off at the end of sentences. And all of these things had been happening over the previous few years. I hadn't even thought anything about it other than, selective hearing on my husband's part, and, or think just like making like weird excuses about any of those things. But when the tremor happened, then I was like, well, something is not right here.
So how long did it take to get a diagnosis?
Well, being a doctor too, we don't kind of go through things the normal way, but so I work at a small regional hospital for Cleveland Clinic. And so it's one of those hospitals where all the doctors still hang out in the doctor's lounge. And so, I knew the neurologist at the hospital. And the hospital president is also an anesthesiologist who I happened to be working with the next day. And so I told him, the hospital president, I said, hey, Dr. Napierkowski, I think I've got Parkinson's. And he kind of laughed. He's like, Sarah, there's no way you have Parkinson's. You're just, I was like, no, but my arm's shaking. And he's like, well, I seriously doubt it. But if it'd make you feel better, I'll call Judah down and see if he can meet up with you in the lounge later. So he arranged for all of that to happen. And the neurologist came down and pulled me aside in a private room off the physician's lounge and heard my story and did an exam and said, yeah, I think it looks like you have Parkinson's. So that's how I found out in the middle of my workday the next day. So there's pros and cons to that. And that, I didn't have to wait 6 months for an appointment. Like, unfortunately, a lot of people do, but I still didn't have really time to process, maybe work through some of the things before actually hearing it.
So what were the next few weeks, months like?
So I had a hard time initially. I pictured the worst. We didn't know anything about exercise and how effective that would be for Parkinson's. And so in my mind, I was picturing the worst for my future. And I kind of went through the stages of grief. Like, I struggled. I had a lot of anxiety and depression. I ended up gaining 30 pounds that first year. And I pictured myself, I don't know if you know the old drawings of what the progression of Parkinson's looks like, but in my mind, right now was, the stage 0 or 1. And I pictured myself in 10 years being the hunched over person in a wheelchair who can't even walk. And so it took me a while to get over that. And it wasn't until I got involved in a research study at Cleveland Clinic that was investigating the effects of exercise on the progression of Parkinson's disease. And I was super fortunate to have met Jay Alberts and be part of his research study. And that's what kind of was the turning point for me to get onto a positive trajectory.
Now, when did you first consider environmental factors as a possible contributor to your diagnosis?
Almost right away. I mean, I thought, I knew that Parkinson's had links to environmental exposures, and I, had been following along on all the burn pit things that were happening to people being exposed to burn pits. When I was stationed in Afghanistan, I slept in a plywood hut with 8 other people, with little curtains in between each of us. Not too far from the burn pits. And I'm a runner, so I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and run the perimeter of the base pretty much every morning with some of my other friends. So, I was doing all the wrong things.
Yeah, right. So, inhaling all the toxins.
Yeah. So in my mind, I was wondering if that contributed to it. And then a year and a half after my diagnosis, I learned from a mutual friend that one of my Air Force Academy track teammates, Jenna, had also been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And it turns out she's also a physician, and she had also been deployed to Afghanistan. It turned out she was there about the same time I was, but at a different base. And then she was ended up being diagnosed the same month that I had been. And so that kind of kicked off the thing. Wow, this cannot be a coincidence. The odds that the two of us have Parkinson's and our stories are so similar, there's got to be more to it. And so we compared notes. We had both applied for VA disability benefits and been denied. We had each served 20 years in the Air Force, and she's still serving part-time in the National Guard. But current Air Force policy denies benefits unless you're diagnosed while on active duty or within a year after leaving active duty.
Within a year?
1 year. And so what we know with progression of Parkinson's disease, it takes 10 to 15 years for that to for the disease to advance enough to diagnosis. And so, we began to look into it further. We found other people who had been cadets at the Air Force Academy while we were there. And I ended up submitting a Freedom of Information Act request asking how many post 9/11 veterans had applied for VA disability for Parkinson's disease. And I can share that with you, but it's over 5,200 post 9/11 veterans have applied for VA disability for Parkinson's disease. So If you look at that, and it's hard to figure out what the denominator is, but conservatively, it's probably about 4 million, which puts it about 1 in 750 to 1 in 1,000 post 9/11 veterans have Parkinson's or have applied for VA disability. And so that's about 10 times higher than, other people our age who are not veterans. And so I really made it my mission to try to advocate for these people, because as we age, we're going to need, if most of us won't be able to work till 65 in the jobs that we currently have. And so I just want to help make sure that those veterans who serve their country have access to the benefits that they deserve. And also I'm pushing the VA to research why this is happening so that we can try to prevent it in future generations.
Yeah, it took them quite a while to acknowledge Camp Leugene's contaminated water. I mean, they
Right.
didn't really acknowledge that till November 13th of 2023. They
Right.
passed the 2022 PACT Act, which provides benefits to those affected post 9/11 veterans from the burn pits, but Parkinson's wasn't included.
Yeah, Parkinson's was not included. The PACT Act of 22 gave benefits to Vietnam veterans who had served in Vietnam, benefits, presumptive service connection for Parkinson's disease. And there was a whole list of other, I forget how many, like 40 other conditions that were given presumptive service connection. But Parkinson's was not one of them. In fact, I don't think there were any neurologic diseases on that list at all. It was primarily cancers and respiratory illnesses that were on that. And what we know about environmental exposure and toxins, it does affect brain health. And there's all sorts. And so trying to raise awareness of that and help ensure that we can figure out how to stop that in the future is really important, because I'm sure it's more than just Camp Lejeune, whose contaminated water issues have caused medical problems.
Well, yeah.
They have
that's the tip of the iceberg, I'm guessing.
Yeah, exactly.
So as an advocate and somebody involved in research studies, how do you think environmental factors are currently being addressed by Parkinson's research?
I have not, to be honest, I've not read a lot. I mean, I've read Dr. Dorsey's book, and I realized, that was pretty eye-opening to me, learning about the history of, the Industrial Revolution, and just seeing how the prevalence of Parkinson's disease is continued to increase as we, continue to have more and more chemicals in our air and our water and all around us. So I mean, I don't know a lot of the specific studies. I've talked to a lot of experts about, their thoughts about it. I was fortunate enough to connect with Dr. John Duda, who's the chief neurologist for the VA system. And we talked about this, and it was a pretty interesting conversation. He was very supportive. We talked about potential causes, and, he thinks and I think he's probably right, that it's a lot of different things, the environmental exposures, but also paired with stress, which, I mean, there was some research that shows that stress decreases the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. So things that may not have been able to cross into the brain otherwise are more easily cross into the brain. The contaminated water supply on bases, people working in maintenance shops exposed to solvents, and the contaminated groundwater. I mean, there's probably more too, but there's a whole list of things that I think probably put veterans at higher risk than other people. And I don't know that it's going to be really, because military people move around from base to base and serve in so many different career fields. I mean, before medical school, believe it or not, I was an aircraft maintenance officer, and I did work in maintenance shops. But, it's so to figure out the differences from, and I've worked at so many different bases around the world. It's hard to figure out like where I may have been, where this insult to my brain would have occurred.
Well, it could have happened several different places along the way.
Exactly. So I think it's probably, and for most of us, I think it's probably multifactorial, and that we do have all these different things that we were exposed to, and just one insult after another to the system at some point.
Yeah. So you were an Air Force maintenance worker.
Mm-hmm.
So what did that entail?
So I was actually, so after Air Force Academy, I'd applied to medical school, and I didn't get in the first time because I didn't have time at all to study for the MCAT, and I did horribly. So I asked my advisor, I was like, I want to get leadership experience. What career field in the Air Force do lieutenants get leadership experience? And I was told security forces or aircraft maintenance officer. And so I said, well, I don't really want to do security forces, but aircraft maintenance officer sounds interesting. So basically it's an office Air Force, you're basically supervising. So I did spend most of my time in the offices I was at a depot base. It was at Kelly Air Force Base right before it closed, which also has contaminated water. But I would walk down through the industrial shops. It was a time right before Kelly was closing. So there was a lot of unhappiness and workplace violence issues. And so I would continuously be going down there to try to help try to sort some of that out, and, try to keep things positive there. But so that was, I've been a lot of places and done a lot of different things. So I think there's been so many, I was a flight surgeon for a few years. So I spent a year in Korea flying in the backseat of F-16s. And so I spent a lot of time on the flight line there. So, I've done so many different cool things, but, here I am with Parkinson's. So
right. And a year ago, you completed the 2023 Ironman World Championship in Kona.
Yeah.
What motivated you to do that?
So I'm crazy. So I've always been an athlete, as you said in your introduction. I mean, I grew up running with my dad. I've always been athletic, and I had been doing triathlons, basically my whole life. And I had gotten back into it pretty seriously in like 2016, 17, and 18. And I was getting a little faster and a little faster. And I thought to myself, wow, I could maybe get a qualifying spot for Ironman Hawaii, which is really, really hard. And so before 2019, I was like hired a coach. I was, working really hard, and my time was 2 hours slower than I had expected it to be. And so I was, really frustrated. So I kind of gave it up after that. I was like, this isn't fun anymore. I worked so hard, getting up before work, every day, and, just working my butt off. And then to be 2 hours slower, it was kind of disheartening. So 2019, I said, okay, forget that. I'll find something else to do. And then COVID happened. And then I was diagnosed in November of 2020. So when I look back on it in hindsight, I think, was the fact that I stopped exercising and then my Parkinson's presented. Was I self-treating myself for years with all my training for triathlons?
Right.
Would I have been diagnosed sooner? I mean, it doesn't really make any difference in the big picture, but it is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So to answer your question, it's kind of an interesting story. So we moved from Utah to Cleveland, Ohio, right before COVID. So in January of 2020, we moved to Ohio. And by July of 2020, things are starting to get a little bit back to normal. And so our family has a big family outing to the grocery store, and we're walking into the grocery store about 5 miles from our house. And out of the grocery store is walking this man is walking with it, has a Loaded Jaw t-shirt on, which is a big bike race in Utah that nobody would know about unless you're a serious cyclist. So to see a guy in Ohio with this, we stopped to talk to him, and he said he had worked for Cleveland Clinic, and I got his name and kind of went on our way. Well, so 4 months later, when I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and my movement disorder specialist gave me this list of research studies, and I was looking through the names. I was like, Jay Albers, how do I know this name? How do I know this name? And I looked at the looked him up online. I was like, oh my gosh, this is this guy I met at the grocery store before I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And he is like the guru and, one of the pioneers in figuring out that exercise is so helpful for Parkinson's. And so I was fortunate. I enrolled in this study. I was fortunate to be randomized to the group that I got a Peloton exercise bike for a year, and got phone calls to tell me to ride it more and more and more and more. And I quickly realized that the more I was riding the bike, the better I felt. And I was sleeping better. Like my anxiety got better. I lost the weight. Everything was feeling better. And so my husband was still doing triathlons, and he had signed up to do a half Ironman in Ohio in July of 2022 at this point. And so, he had already been training for like 4 months before it. By the time I decided, you know what, I've gotten up to riding the bike for an hour and I feel pretty strong. I could probably do a half Ironman again. And so I secretly signed up for the race. I didn't tell him about it because I kind of thought it was kind of an over the top goal. And I kind of doubted it myself, but I didn't want anybody else to tell me that it was crazy. So I signed up for it and I started training. And, after about 2 months, things were going really well. So I told him I'd signed up for it. And I kept training. My goal initially was just to finish the race. And as I got closer, I realized I could have a good race. And so I changed my goal to try to go under 6 hours and try to qualify for the half Ironman World Championships. And so on the day of the race, everything went great. I beat my goal time of under 6 hours by about 10 minutes. I beat my husband by close to an hour. And I qualified for the half Ironman World Championships, which were in October of 2022. And so I did that race in St. George, Utah, which was awesome. And then every year, I love triathlon, and the Super Bowl of triathlon are the Ironman World Championships. And there's a documentary that they make every year about Ironman, and we watch it. And in 2023, and they always feature a motivational athlete. And in 2023, that was Chris Nikic, who was the first person with Down syndrome to finish an Ironman. And so I was watching this and saw, how inspirational he was, and how many people he had inspired with Down syndrome about what you can do and what is possible with hard work, and how much big a difference that he made in his life and a whole lot of others. And so I had the thought that, I if he's able to, he must have more, he probably has more challenges than I do. And if he can do this, then there's no reason I can't as well. And so I wrote Ironman and told them my story after seeing that. And I wrote them it was probably about January of 2023 that I wrote them and telling them my story, and that my dream was to make it to the finish line at Ironman. And I didn't hear anything back from them until the first week in August of 2023, when they called me and offered me a slot to compete in Ironman Kona, which was now 9 weeks away. So I kind of realized that, unfortunately, I was training for a marathon at the time. So it wasn't, and I had done a half Ironman in just a few months earlier. So I wasn't starting from nothing, but 9 weeks is not much time. But I realized it was a once in a lifetime experience, and I just needed to get to the finish line, and I went for it. And it was an incredible experience in every way. So
that's amazing.
Awesome. So I ended up being the featured athlete in the documentary for 2023. And as part of that, they have a clip at the end where Chris Nikic runs with me towards the finish line, holding my hand, which was just incredible. He happened to be there at the 25-mile mark. And it was, the whole experience was just surreal.
All right. For those who may be at risk of Parkinson's or are newly diagnosed, especially those who suspect environmental exposure, what advice would you give them based on your own experience?
I think, the most helpful thing for me was to meet and talk to other people with Parkinson's disease. My neurologist went above and beyond, telling me that my life was still going to be fine, and I was still going to I still had amazing, a lot of good years ahead of me. And I kind of blew him off and didn't listen to him at all. And
doctors, when they say that, you're like, I don't believe you.
Exactly. And it wasn't until I met other people who had been living with this disease for 10 or 15 years and seeing, the ones who exercised and had a positive attitude, how well that they were doing, that I realized that, I needed to change my mindset and make some big goals and get going. And so, I've been super fortunate to meet some amazing people along the way. Karen Jaffe, who is here in Ohio, who helped start our big community center here in Cleveland called In Motion, which offers free exercise classes and programming for people with Parkinson's disease. She's an OBGYN doctor that had been diagnosed 10 years before me. And so to see her, and at that point, she was 10 years post-diagnosis, she looked amazing. Most people wouldn't realize she even had Parkinson's unless you told her. And unless she told you. And so, to see her like that helped change my mind. And then I've been I'm meeting Rhonda Fouds at Boston Marathon last year. And, her story is unbelievable too. For those of you who don't know, she was diagnosed 25 years ago and is still, at this point, has run over 100 marathons and is still going. And so to see that gives me hope that, maybe, if I keep working hard, I hope that 25 years from now that I can have a handful of, she's got like 13 Boston Marathon medals, and she's still going. And so, meeting people like that has made a huge difference. So for people newly diagnosed, I think it's important to take some time to understand the diagnosis. And yes, it is, your future is going to be different than maybe you planned. But
there's definitely some grieving that goes on for what you thought your future was.
You have this idea of what your future is going to be like, and it all changes. But when I look back at it, I realize now that my life has so much more meaning and purpose, and I've been able to help so many more people since my diagnosis than I had in the rest of my career as a physician. And so, I feel, Michael J. Fox often refers to Parkinson's as the gift that keeps on taking. Yeah. And in many ways, it has been a gift to me. And yes, I still struggle with things, but, I found that, by continuing to interact with other people who are struggling and sharing our challenges, that it makes it easier. And, that's so people newly diagnosed really take the time to connect with others who are going through it, because you'll realize that, it's a big deal, but it's in many ways you have the potential to change your life for the better.
Yeah. You are an inspiration from not just, an exercise perspective and a fitness perspective, but also with what you're doing with the military now and trying to change things there and get Parkinson's on the radar. That's huge.
Yeah, I've been actually invited to speak to a conference for VA neurologists. There's a national conference actually next week in Philadelphia, where I'll be speaking to a group of basically all the neurologists who work in the VA systems. And I hope to be able to share my story and raise some awareness of these issues there as well, and hope to get in some motivation to get some research funded to study all of this. So
now, are they who you need to convince, or is there somebody else you need to convince in order to
it's going to be a combination. I'm going a lot of different angles. I've also contacted my congressman, in my case, Dave Joyce and his team, and talked to them potentially about amending the PACT Act to include Parkinson's disease. But in order to do that, it would be very helpful to have a research study that shows some data that shows that it is a lot more likely, besides my Freedom of Information Act request numbers, like an official published study, especially by the VA. If we can show that, I think it'll be a lot easier to get the policy changed. But I think getting the support of those neurologists will help with that. I'm still trying to figure out, and I'm hoping by talking to some of these people at the VA next week that I can help try to figure out what process I need to, what's going to be the most effective to try to get the policy changed.
Well, keep us posted, and best of luck, and thanks for all you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been an interesting experience. I mean, like I said, some veterans have been able to have appealed it, and they have to hire attorneys and show that they were stationed at bases and exposed to things, and they have been successful. So I don't want to, say there's no hope for you getting it now. I mean, if you want to hire an attorney and do that, but I don't think a veteran should have to hire an attorney for something that seems as simple as, it's clear cut that, I think more likely than not, my military service in some way contributed to my diagnosis. Yeah. And I don't think veterans should have to hire an attorney to prove that. So I'm trying to get policy changed so that's not such an ordeal. That's a huge deal that you're doing that. So thank you. I hope we can pull it off. And my friend Jenna, the other physician, Air Force physician, she and I have been working on this together. And we recently partnered with another female Air Force Academy grad who graduated 4 years after us, also with Parkinson's. So if you look at it, there's only less than 1,000 women graduated from the Air Force Academy between 95 and 2000, and 3 of us have Parkinson's, which, when you consider that Parkinson's is less common in women, and, we're all young, is pretty compelling, I think. Absolutely. All right, Sarah, thank you so much. And give my regards to Karen. I know her very well. Oh, you know, Karen, she's awesome. Yes. And it's a pleasure catching up with you. Your story and the reaction you had after your diagnosis reminds me of mine. Yes. When I talk to people, that's so common. And I'm so lucky to have met Karen as early as I did. I met her for coffee probably within a month of my diagnosis. And that really helped set me on a more positive trajectory. So I've actually put together a website for that very purpose to try to convey that. It's called Parkinson's with a Z at the end.org. But it's a lot of that information, like telling this story about the grieving process that I went through and how and then learning the power of gratitude and the things that I've learned along the way and what's made the biggest difference for me. That's great. So it's Parkinson's with a Z? Yep. So parkinsonz.org. Okay. So yeah. We'll maybe we could put that in the show notes. Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. That's great. So thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Very good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. The Brian Grant Foundation empowers people impacted by Parkinson's to lead active and fulfilling lives. Help support our efforts at briangrant.org. A special thank you to Raphael Sadiq for providing the music for this podcast. This podcast is produced by Brian Griggs. Learn more at griggsproductions.com.